All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And I've been going over some fundamental CSS, and I'm about to right here. So I did one lesson on internal, external, and inline CSS. And I also introduced classes and IDs. Then I did another on divs and colors, and then did a third on floating and position. So in this one, I'm going to attempt to finish up pretty much everything in regular CSS. So taking it from the top, we've looked at margins already. And again, to try to make it hopefully easier for us, I brought up a bunch of pages from W3 schools. All right. Now, one thing to realize when you're working with margins is margins always, they're like a clock. Top, right, bottom, left. So if you can imagine 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock. All right, and there's shortcuts that you can use. Now this is not a shortcut. So you'll notice here, if I say margin 10 pixels, 5 pixels, 15 pixels, 20 pixels, that's not a shortcut. All right, it's like, I shouldn't say that because it is. It's like saying margin top 10 pixels, margin right 5 pixels, margin bottom 15 pixels, margin left 20 pixels. All right, so yeah, it is a shortcut. If you only list 3 of them, all right, the top margin becomes 10 pixels, the right and left become 5 pixels, and the bottom is 15 pixels. It's a little confusing. Finally, if you only list 2 of them, the first one is top and bottom, the second one is left and right, and if you only list 1, it goes for all of them. Now, ideally at least, that makes sense. All right, and this is supported in every browser. When you set up margins, okay, you can have a length. Now, one thing we haven't talked too much about, but I do want to mention that to you right now. They say, for example here, pixels, points, and centimeters. All right. If you put a length in there and you say pixels or you say points or you say centimeters, if you say something like that, those are fixed lengths. In other words, they don't go and reset themselves basically based on the type of device that's being used. However, if you use either percentages or if you use ems, then it does basically justify or set itself up based on the type of device that's being used. If you say auto, the browser calculates the margin, and if you say auto for the left and right, it'll attempt to center whatever you're working with on the page. You can have initial for a default and inherit if you want to inherit from a parent element. All right. Now the margin collapse, when you look at on here, it says here the top and bottom margins are sometimes collapsed into a single margin that is equal to the largest of the 2 margins. This does not happen on horizontal, only vertical margins. So sometimes, and they give an example here. So the H1 has a bottom margin of 30 pixels. The P has a top margin of 20 pixels. It says common sense would suggest that the vertical margin between these two would be a total of 50 pixels. But due to margin collapse, the actual margin ends up being only 30 pixels. Now, for what we're doing right now, that's really not that important of a concept. All right, again, you can have just margin bottom, same kind of stuff that we looked at before, same kind of stuff we saw here, so nothing new there. You can have margin left, again, same stuff that we looked at. You can have margin right and have margin top. All right, so you can set all of them, any one of them, any two of them, any three of them. All right, so it's all, as always, it's up to you. Okay, so that's pretty much it for margins. There weren't a lot of examples there, but ideally it makes some sense to you. Next is padding. And the good news about padding is the shortcuts and the like work the exact same way as they did for margins. All right, how about this? CSS padding versus margin example. Wait, I didn't take that very well. Exam, P-L-E, example. Wow. Padding versus margin. So, what's the difference between padding and margin in CSS? It's great to know about the difference between them. They have some differences. Margin is the outer space of an element. Padding is the inner space of an element. Margin is the space outside of the element, while padding is the space inside of the element. We may have looked at this before. This is the CSS box model. So everything that you create in CSS, whether you realize it or not, gets created inside of a box. Where it says content, that is where, all right, where it says content, that's the actual HTML content. Content is surrounded by padding. All right, then you have a border, which may or may not even be visible. On the outside of the border is the margin. So again, as it says there, the content is where you've got text, you've got images, or whatever. The padding, all right, is the area around the content. The border is after the padding, and the margin is outside of the border. So I want to look at the example that they have here. Let's take a look at a couple of them here. So copy. I'm going to go back to what we had been working on previously. So I'll have to bring that up, I guess. Test, I need the index. That's that humongous file that we've been working on. And we also have our style.css file. All right. And I think we commented all of that out. So we now say this is what we're doing with a div. All right. Now I'm going to change this in just a minute, but I want you to see it. So right now this div is 300 pixels. It has a 25 pixel solid green border around it. It has 25 pixels of padding, and it has 25 pixels of margin. Okay, that's all fine. Now, that said, let's come in here. And this is the stuff we've been working on with positioning and the like. So that's all done now. We'll just put a div in here. All right, and inside of that div we'll put some sample text. Hopefully that'll show you what I want to show you here. All right, so there it is. Now, is that big a thing? It will be in a minute. So what I want to show you is I want to go back to the CSS and I want to start changing this. The border's fine, the width is fine. Let's change the padding from 25 to 125 pixels. All right, just the padding. So watch what happens. All right, you notice That's the area that's in here. That is the padding. Now, if we go in and change the margin to 125 pixels and change the padding back to 25 pixels, it pretty much looks the same way that it did before. All right? But what we need to do here, just so you see this, is I'm going to put underneath this, underneath this div, oh, and I think I put it in CSS. All right, and I screwed that up royally. Hopefully this is going to show you something that I'm not wasting my time and yours. All right, so we now have here this, okay? Now you might say, big deal, who cares? It will be a big deal in just a minute, all right? And the reason that it'll be a big deal is now I want to go back and I want to change my CSS back from a margin of 125 to a margin of 25. And notice what happens as far as this area here. See that? So the bottom line is this. The padding is what's in here. All right? So if you've got a border, all right, it's the area between the content and the border. The margin, on the other hand, is the area between the border and what comes next. Now, hopefully that made some sense. Now, where that gets confusing, okay, I'm going to come back and I'm going to do one more thing, and then we're going to put this to rest, so to speak. All right, I'm going to remove the border for right now. So I'm just going to remove the border by commenting that line out. All right, then I'm going to come back to here, and I'm going to remove this paragraph. All right, so let's see how different it looks. You see, it doesn't look any different. All right, well, hopefully you'll notice this. I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to actually add that paragraph back again. Okay, so let's add that paragraph back. Okay, so there's what we have. Now, let's try this one more time. All right, so let's first go in here. Let's first go in here and we'll set the padding to 125 pixels as we did before. All right. That's the area that was in here that changed. So you see what happens, okay? Now I'm going to come back and I'm going to change it back to 25 and I'm going to make the margin 125 pixels. All right? And let's refresh. There's the problem. You go, what do you mean there's the problem? The problem is that typically when you're not working with borders, there are a lot of times at least you can use either padding or border. Padding and border become more important when you've got everything. So in other words, when you have border and when you have other when you have the border and when you have other content on the page. Okay, hopefully that made some sense. So I'm trying to make sense here. All right. Okay, let's jump back into here. So we've talked about padding, we've talked about border. Next is font. And we've talked somewhat about font. Okay, we've looked at some of the stuff that's in here. And again, I'm not going to run through a lot of examples here. I'd rather just talk to you about it. Font style. Okay, for font style, what you can set font style to is you can set it to, I think it's one of 3 values. Okay, and you can set it either to normal, which is the default, so you don't have to set it. You can set it to italic, or you can set it to oblique. And I believe that oblique looks pretty much just like italic does. All right. More often than not, when you use this, it is used, I think at least, to set something to italic. Variant I don't work with much. Font weight, there's more to it than what I've shown you. All right, because I've said font weight bold, but you can actually set it to bold, bolder, lighter, and the amount of boldness you want. So 400, you notice, is the same as normal, 700 is the same as bold, and I believe 900 is the same as bolder. All right, so you can set the different font weights. More often than not, the one that you're going to use there is more often than not, the one that you're going to use there is bold. All right. Font size is literally that. How many pixels, etc. you want something to be. You can also set line height. Font family, we've talked about. You can have one or more things in there, and whatever you have in there, it goes. So if I've got font family, then I have Arial, comma, Times New Roman, comma, etc. And if I keep doing stuff, then maybe a serif. Then what it'll try to do is whatever one I list first, so if that's Arial, it'll try to load an Arial font. If it can't find an Arial font, then it'll pick the next one. If it's Times New Roman, then it'll try to find that one. All right, and with Times New Roman, since there are spaces between the Times in the New and the New in the Roman, that must be in double quotes. All right. Finally, if it can't find that, it'll take a sans serif font. All right. Caption and icon and menu. I'm not even going to talk about any of these. So there are some examples in here. All right. Let's just copy them. Again, I'm going to put some space in here. And we've got what? Font caption, font icon, font menu. So these are some of the ones that I just said I wasn't going to talk about. But let's look at them and see what they look like. All right, the browser font used for different types of things. And you may or may not be able to tell when you look at this, but these are different. These are different types of fonts. The sizes are different, and the actual font type is different. That's pretty much it, I believe, on fonts. All right. Next is text. And we have looked at this. When you do text align, you can set it to center, which centers it on the page, left to left justify, right to right justify, or you can set it to justify. All right. And again, very easy then to do, and you can set up as many, you can have everything set up differently if you want. You get some very different looking effects. Text decoration. If you say text decoration none, more often than not, the text decoration none is almost always going to be used for hyperlinks. Because with text decoration none, then it will not show the underline for the hyperlink. All right, and there's other things. I mean, typically you're not going to choose overline, underline, and line through. Okay, but you can. Text transformation is kind of a neat one. If I do this, again, it's much easier just to show you this. So if I come in here and put P dot uppercase, all right, so paragraphs with a class of uppercase are automatically going to be transformed into uppercase. All right, so you'll see, whoops, when I go in here, if I put in a paragraph and I just put in, now is the time for all good people to come to the aid of their party. All right, let's copy that a few times. And notice that when I run this, whoops, it's all in lowercase, but when I run it, I've told the system, oh, did I not save my CSS? Oh, I didn't set the class. So P class equal, class equal uppercase. Okay, now refresh and you see it's all in uppercase. Now, that example works, and as you'd imagine, I could come in here and I could change this, or I shouldn't say change it, but I'll put another one in here that's called lowercase and make that lowercase. Okay. And I'm just going to grab everything that's in here because it's already in uppercase. So we'll come back here and we'll add another paragraph. And we'll be smart enough this time to say class, class equal lowercase. Now paste that in. And I'll put my P down below it. So this one, the first one, although it's not lowercase, should appear in uppercase. The second one, although it's in uppercase, since the class is lowercase, should appear in lowercase. And you see that it does work. Now, more often than not, when you use the text transform, all right, you may or may not agree with what I'm about to say, which is totally fine. But more often than not, when you use the text transform, you may have seen this already where sometimes on a web page, the first sentence on a page you might make in uppercase, the whole first sentence. All right. So, all right, and there's indentation, letter spacing, line height. Let's look at those. So we've got P dot small and P dot big. So let's add those. P dot small, which says the line height should only be 80%. Let's even make it smaller. Let's make it 40%. All right, so we've got a P dot small and a P dot big. And let's go, and this one's a little more reminiscent, I think. So I'm going to remove this one. And I'll just take the end, that's at the beginning of each line, and capitalize it. Okay. Now I'm going to grab this again, copy it, and paste it. And these were called small and big. So here we'll have class of small, and here we'll have class of big, just so you can see the difference between the two. That's kind of weird looking, but you get the idea. So it specifies the space between lines. Oh, okay, that wasn't, yeah, that is the line height. So I guess that 8 would have been better than 4 because 4 it looked too squished together. So let's go back and we'll change the CSS from 4. Let's make it 7.5. And now let's bring this up again and refresh. And that looks a little better. Still looks kind of squished, but it looks better than it did look. Here, this is almost looks like double spacing or whatever. All right. The link tag we have talked about before, in particular, how you set up a hyperlink. So we've looked at that. All right, nothing new there. There are different attributes you can put in there. Okay, I've never worked with any of these other than ref. So I've never used any of the other ones that are in there. Target, I shouldn't say that because target, although it's not supported in HTML5, is where the link will be loaded. All right, so underscore blank, which would say open it up in a new window, etc. All right, so let's go back to our list. Now, maybe I did this one a little bit differently, but I did talk about margins. I talked about padding, tried to show you examples of each one of those. All right, talked about borders. We turned borders on and turned them off. Talked about fonts. Showed a little bit about styling and aligning, and a little bit about styling links, but not really very much. All right, so that's about it for here. As far as further reading, I've given you a bunch of different URLs already, so I don't feel the need to keep doing that here, but I did want to mention one thing. All right, which you may or may not have an interest in. But if you go out to CSSZengarden.com, I thought that's what it was. Maybe it's just zengarden.com. Okay, let's look it up. CSS Zengarden. Well, it says there that's the way it is. There you go. What this site, CSSZengarden.com, was designed to have a bunch of different examples and a few other things in there to show you some of the stuff that you can do with CSS. All right, just so you're aware of that. Maybe you care, maybe you don't care. All right, I'm going to go and do one more thing. I'm just going to type in here cascading style sheets. And there's one more thing that I want to show you, and that is right here. Good, came up right away. And this is the Cascading Style Sheets homepage at W3 School, or I'm sorry, at the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C. All right. And there'll be a lot of information that's in there, a lot more than you probably think when you look at this. But what I did want to mention to you is, when you look at the stuff that's in here, and you look at the things that are in there for the W3C, they're written by technical writers. This is very dry stuff, and there's nothing at all wrong with it. All right, nothing at all wrong with it. But that said, not the best of reads. Okay, I think that's enough for now. When I come back, I'm going to talk a little bit more, but I'm going to talk about advanced selectors, pseudo classes, gradients, shadows, transforms and animations, and layouts and calculations. All right?